Good day, everyone, and welcome to The Literary Machine. I'm your host, K.O. Lin, and in this podcast, I will dive into stories and analyze how effective the storytelling is. I'm back for another critical analysis of a timeless classic, Terminator 2, Judgment Day. In this episode, I will, of course, be detailing all the things that make this story fantastic, and the things that make it less fantastic. Specifically, the scenes from the extended cut. Before we dive in, I would ask that if you're enjoying this podcast, please like and subscribe, especially if you're listening to YouTube. It really helps me get the word out. I've also started streaming video games. The first game is Subnautica, an indie survival game that takes place on an ocean planet. I break down the story elements and the world building in real time. The 1980s and 1990s had some of the best action-adventure flicks to ever grace the silver screen. Predator, Aliens, Terminator, Terminator 2, the first three Die Hards, and The Fugitive. There are more, but those are the most prominent. All of these are personal favorites, though I could live without Die Hard 2. And if I had to rank Terminator 2, I would put it just a notch above Aliens 1986 for the greatest action flick of all time, as I mentioned in my previous episode. And I chose that rank because Terminator 2, the theatrical cut, was perfect as is. Aliens is still a great flick, but I do think the director's cut for Aliens was necessary for the storytelling to give it proper pacing and fulfill the character arcs. Perhaps one day I'll do a podcast about those extra scenes and why they're fundamental, but I digress. This is about Terminator 2. I'm not going to say that the extended edition ruined Terminator 2, because no, it didn't. And there's nothing wrong if you like the extended edition. It was released after a demand for more good content, so I can hardly blame them for trying to spice up an original classic. However, in terms of storytelling, it threw off the pacing and had some ridiculous excess. At least the theatrical cut still exists. James Cameron didn't try to scrub the theatrical release like George Lucas did to the original Star Wars trilogy. I watched the remastered OT just recently, and the Return of the Jedi was so bad. Those scenes in Jabba the Hutt's palace were a serious downgrade from the original. Never have I been more grateful to own the original cuts. For those who haven't seen Terminator 2, well, why not? Truly, if you ever needed a sign to go and see it, this is it. Ever wanted a big budget extravaganza that has some epic chase scenes and explosions, but also manages to fit in a decent plot and a lot of heart? This is your movie. Watch it now, because this is your warning that I'm about to spoil it and give a scene-by-scene breakdown of the extended cut. As per usual, I will offer a relatively quick summary of the movie to get everyone up to speed. Terminator 2 begins with a cut to the future showing a battle raging between the machines and humans. It focuses on a grizzled man overseeing the battle, and it's made clear that this is John Connor, quote, leader of the human resistance, unquote, who is Sarah Connor's son. Sarah Connor is giving a quiet and somber narration to set the stage and says that two Terminators were sent back in time, one to kill her before her son John Connor was born, and then one to kill John as a child. As it turns out, Arnold is the good guy in this one, which is a refreshing change of pace. Well, it's refreshing to see a bad guy turned good guy. Not like Arnold isn't frequently the action in a great deal of 90s movies. Robert Patrick plays as the cold killer robot wearing a police officer's uniform, which apparently is forever prescient. Yikes. The rest of the movie is good guy Terminator and bad guy Terminator in a race to complete their objectives with lots of explosive crossover. And I do mean explosive, literally, because that seemed to have taken a huge portion of the film's budget. James Cameron is, or perhaps was, the master of practical stunts. The behind-the-scenes special effects videos were incredible. The early 90s innovation from both Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park really blew open the field of 3D graphics. Say what you will about the cheesy 3D cartoons that started rolling out after, but 3D is pretty darn crucial to nearly all of our entertainment. There are, of course, arguments about the negatives of using too much 3D, but I'm pretty sure that's a subject for a different podcast. Alright, let's talk about the new scenes and why I think most of them should have been left on the cutting room floor. In the first new scene, the hospital aides punish Sarah. Kyle Reese visits Sarah in her dreams, and there's a hint about the contents of her dreams. The first new scene happens when Dr. Silverman commands 2 aides to deal with Sarah because she decided to flip her bed to do pull-ups. The aides beat Sarah, shock her with a taser, and force-feed her a sedative. Kyle Reese, her protector and lover, comes to her in her drug-induced sleep to motivate her and keep her spirit strong. Then he vanishes, and it morphs into the nuclear dream, though the dream doesn't fully play out at this point. I'm not a terribly big fan of the scene. Admittedly, there aren't actually many scenes where the aides' abuse of the patients is evident, but this sort of plays into a mental hospital stereotype. To some extent, it relies on cultural supposition to give that impression before it really shows its cards. I suppose you could say that it's Kyle's pep talk that really gives Sarah the motivation to do what she does in the movie, but in the theatrical cut, the motivation was framed as needing to be there for her son. This is a very humanizing element to Sarah's character and shows what kind of mother she is. I mean, she's irresponsible as hell and perhaps a little dangerous, but we know her reasons from the first movie and we can sympathize with her already as a result. She does what she does for her son and for the future of humanity. The scene just wasn't really necessary because the information that was intended to be conveyed in the scene is already conveyed more effectively and subtly in other scenes. In the next extended cut scene, the T-1000 steals a police car. This scene takes place after the first major car chase, where the T-1000 was chasing down John with a semi. This scene is all of, 15 seconds? Why do we need to see this? He's already killed 1 police officer and stolen his car. It's really not a stretch to think he'd steal another. I realize the LAPD has a lot of cops on its force, but you'd think there'd be some kind of bulletin about someone stealing cop cars after it was done twice. But nitpicking about finicky story details is not really what we're here for, so moving on. In the next extended cut scene, the T-1000 kills Max the dog and searches the house. This scene takes place after John calls his foster parents to warn them about the T-1000. The original Terminator asks about the dog using a fake name which outs the T-1000, so the T-1000 finds the dog and kills it to show its name is Max. Again, this is another scene that takes maybe 30 seconds, and all it does is verify to the viewer that the T-1000 realized he'd been had. I mean, he should have realized that as soon as the Terminator hung up the phone. I suppose that's another notch in the bad guy's belt to show just how irredeemably evil he is, but, he's a Terminator. He's not like Arnold, who has been reprogrammed. He is acting exactly as he was meant to. For storytelling purposes, I want to compare this to a small scene that happens later, after the T-1000 fails to kill John, when the 3 of them escape from the Pescadero State Hospital. He just sort of casually walks back to the scene of the crime. An officer on his motorbike rides up to him and says, "Are you okay?" And the T-1000 says, "Fine." Say, that's a nice bike. And then it cuts. We don't need for the rest of the scene to play out to know he kills the guy and takes his wheels. The same could be said about Max the dog. The scene then transitions to the T-1000 searching John's room for more information. You could argue that this gives us insight into John's personality because we see how his room is decorated. Naturally, it also leads the T-1000 to information about where Sarah Connor is, but again, it's just not needed. We see a scene where other cops are interrogating Sarah about the Terminator who was photographed during the mall incident. The T-1000 could have just as easily heard a bulletin about Sarah Connor in the penitentiary or looked her up in his little computer in the cop car. How he gets the information ultimately doesn't matter. I will admit, though, the way he searches the room is creepy, but he was already creepy. In the next scene, John speaks with the Terminator and resets the switch inside the Terminator so that he can begin to learn. This scene takes place after John, Sarah, and the Terminator escape the hospital. They break into some abandoned warehouse to repair, stitch up, sleep, and dump the car. While Sarah is pulling bullets out of the Terminator, John asks the Terminator if he's capable of learning more. The Terminator mentions that he's capable of learning, but they have to flip a switch on the microchip in his head. Resetting the switch means it can learn to act more human. This scene is pretty much the only one that I would advocate should have been in the theatrical cut. It was vitally important, primarily for expanding on the characterizations of both John and Sarah. When Sarah initially encounters the Terminator at the hospital, she immediately turns on her heels and flees, screaming in terror. She is clearly still suffering from the trauma of being hunted and nearly killed multiple times. That doesn't just disappear, especially since she's not getting the actual treatment that she deserves. Therefore, it made sense when Sarah picked up a hammer to smash the Terminator's CPU. We can clearly see her pain and suffering. She doesn't deserve to live in fear. However, John rightfully stops her and reminds her that he was the one who reprogrammed the Terminator and sent it back from the future. His older self wasn't doing it to traumatize his mother all over again, but because they would need his kind of resistance to combat the T-1000. John was only 10 when he made this judgment, but he wisely points out that if he's supposed to be a great military leader, then perhaps his mom should listen to him occasionally. And as it turns out, his judgment on this issue is rock solid. Later in the movie, Sarah is able to learn everything she's always wanted to know about how Skynet actually comes to be. The Terminator acts as a willing font of information. Later in the movie, he makes himself an example to Miles Dyson and teaches Dyson about the future and his role in humanity's downfall. We see the Terminator walk into rooms where the fire suppression system is sucking out the oxygen, where he is unaffected by tear gas, where he tanks all the SWAT team's bullets to extract John and Sarah to safety. He ended up being a massive ace in the hole. This scene offers critical character development for both John and Sarah, and it's a shame that it was cut. The movie still works great without the scene. However, it would have given John's character a much-needed boost to help us get past the child we see, even if him being a child is still pretty crucial to the movie. The next scene is an expanded section on the Terminator learning. John decides to teach the Terminator what a smile is and how to smile. John tries to butter up one of the workers at a food truck who isn't in the mood for his crap, so then he points out a guy who's on the phone and smiling. Then the Terminator attempts to smile and, it's off-putting and dorky. The movie put a lot of emphasis on the Terminator learning. It starts, of course, with John teaching him lame teenage slang in the car. We also see this demonstrated when he's talking with the Terminator while they're underneath the car, fixing it, and he explains crying. And again, with the teaching high five. These are legitimately sweet moments that show the Terminator and John bonding. But once a pattern has been established, John teaching the Terminator, it can be assumed that in the space between scenes, off camera, that John continues to teach the Terminator. We don't need to see every facet. This scene is 2 minutes of John and the Terminator goofing around. It throws off the pacing, it does a complete tone switch, and it suggests that they're not still very much on the run and trying to keep their heads low. The dorky smile is a bit off-putting. It's supposed to be, but it feels off-putting in the wrong kind of way. It's too cheesy in a film where the cheesiest thing should be the Terminator's epic one-liners. Now, it's a lighthearted moment, and these sort of moments are often needed to lift the film up from time to time because you don't want your audience to be too much in the gloom, especially for a film that includes a kid. But this scene is just sort of lame and doesn't really offer the same sense of warmth that the other teaching scenes did. It's not horrible, but it's not great either. In the next scene, Miles Dyson explains his intentions for the neural net processor to his wife, Teresa. This scene shows Miles Dyson's wife barging in on him and interrupting his workaholic lifestyle so that he can indulge his children as he promised. In the process, he explains how revolutionary his neural net processor will be for technology. The purpose of this scene is to both explain his neural net processor and, by extension, what link it has to the creation of Skynet, and to humanize Miles Dyson. He just seems like your everyday engineer. He has a beautiful wife, he has cute children, and in the end, he sets work aside to be a good father. Unlike many of the scenes already mentioned, this scene actually serves a true purpose. It isn't necessarily wrong, it's just not needed. Miles Dyson is a minor character who's going to be dead in 20 minutes. I mean, the movie allowed him to redeem himself in 10 minutes, so it's not like it does his character a complete disservice. His role in the story is minimal, and for that reason, it should stay minimal. After all, in this very first scene, he's not even written like he's a bad dude. He just seems like an affable fellow, but even he doesn't know where the original Terminator parts came from. He was made into a dupe by larger unnamed forces, who don't ultimately matter either. Also, the scene includes Teresa licking Miles to get his attention, which... you do you, but this plays into that saying, if I had a nickel for every time someone was licked in Terminator 2, I'd have 2 nickels. It's not a lot, but it's a bit weird that it happened twice. It makes me wonder if James Cameron has some sort of licking fetish like Quentin Tarantino with his foot fetish. The next scene is an extended weapons introduction. The Terminator opens the dusty cellar and we get an extended scene that introduces some of the key weapons for Endgame, and John asks the Terminator about fear and dying. This is a pretty short scene and continues to develop John and the Terminator's relationship just a bit more. Hardly the worst, just, again, not all that necessary and could be deemed as padding. It could have made it into theatrical cut, and it probably would have been seamless. I think it was originally cut because John's question is a little bit silly. Certainly, there have been stories, particularly in the last 10 years, that present the idea of robots having feelings, but that wasn't really the case for the 90s. Of course, a robot doesn't fear dying. It's programmed to function a certain way, and the programmer would have made sure not to include something as human as the fear of death, or the Terminator wouldn't do what it's meant to do. It doesn't really need to be said. The penultimate scene of the extended cut is when the T-1000 is busted during the final fight scene. I don't enjoy the hyperbole that is so popular with internet culture. You know what I mean. This is why X is garbage. X person was destroyed by Y thing. It's dumb, and I wish it was not a thing to get people's attention. But the extended add-ons to the infight, I honestly believe, ruin it. Not the whole movie, just the fight. But it's the main reason why I refuse to acknowledge the extended cut's existence and will only ever watch the theatrical cut. A bit dramatic? Probably. Robert Patrick, the actor who played the T-1000, is just a regular-sized person next to hulking Arnold. There are primarily 2 reasons why the T-1000 is still an intimidating threat, despite his size difference. Robert Patrick plays the part so coldly. It truly is admirable that he taught himself to shoot without blinking, because holy creep factor. And 2, that he seems utterly unstoppable. While being shot inhibits him, that's only temporary. He can heal himself back to new after every encounter. When he reforms from being shattered into pieces at the end, his eyes open. His skin and the police uniform are just as fresh as when he came into the world. At this point, you're thinking, what is going to stop this guy? That tension, that fear is what carries the T-1000 through to the end. So it's unbelievably underwhelming when the extra scenes cut to him melting into the floor. That signals that he's already on death's doorstep. We know now that it's just a matter of getting him into a vulnerable place. Remember the scene where John hears his mother calling for help and he comes back? We know that the T-1000 just sampled Sarah. We know from Sarah's character scenes that her calling John for help is unlikely. But when John comes back and sees his mother limping towards him, there's just that briefest moment of uncertainty and fear. Is it Sarah? Or is it the T-1000? In the extended cut, John just looks at the floor and sees the feet melting into the grating and can be certain it's not his mom. Without that cut, there is so much more tension when, for even the briefest of moments, you can think, it is the T-1000, right? John didn't just give the go-ahead and kill his mom, right? I think I can see why these extra graphics were initially included, and I certainly don't think it was because James Cameron wanted to unnecessarily drag out his movie. The T-1000 has seemed flawless up to this point, and perhaps his thought process is that the audience needed some hope for the ending. Perhaps this is meant to foreshadow the final grenade launcher shot where the T-1000 can't put himself back together. After all, he's been able to heal after everything else. Why would the grenade launcher be any different? This makes the final scene a bit improbable, so they were trying to bridge that gap. Oftentimes, foreshadowing is needed in order to nail a surprise, but sometimes it's not. It does beg the question which surprises or twists are better when coming out of nowhere as opposed to being shocking. This is something that is really best determined on a case-by-case basis. It's generally not good storytelling to rely on subversion and go straight for the twist. However, I think what makes this particular surprise work is because we were reasonably assured that the T-1000 ultimately wouldn't win. I have difficulty believing that Terminator 2 would be a beloved classic if Sarah and John die, because, that's just grim. There's actually a bit of cultural divide about endings. Without wading too far into the weeds, Eastern cultures have a preference for sad or bittersweet endings, because it's rare for life to ever be fair or live happily ever after. Whereas Western cultures tend to prefer the happy endings. It would have been pretty shocking and likely criticized if Terminator 2 went the grim route. So yeah, most of the extended scenes in the cut are just meh. They're either alright or simply unnecessary padding. This scene, though, actually detracts from the finale, and that is a real shame. To top off the extended cut, it was given a new ending. The old ending is quite simple. The camera is moving across a dark highway at night, with Sarah Connor continuing her narration and expressing hope in the future. It's vague and uplifting, but it gets the point across. For those who haven't seen the director's cut, it was given a new ending. We cut to Sarah in old age makeup, sitting at the park, watching John play with his own children. It's a happily ever after, and Sarah narrates that John continues his fight against Skynet by fighting in the Senate of the United States government against other laws and bills that attempt to make Skynet a reality. I'm not going to say that this scene is bad either. It's more a matter of preference. I'm of the opinion that less is more. This new ending is almost too saccharine and cheerful for what the protagonists suffer. It also personally wrecks my suspension of disbelief. So, Sarah, you're a juvenile delinquent of a son who participated in terroristic activities that included blowing up a building, stealing numerous cars, and being an accessory to police officers being injured, managed to work back from that to get a job in the Senate? I have doubts. I also have doubts that Sarah would actually be out of the mental institution enjoying her life. I can only imagine that they had to get fake identities to get past that, which creates its own set of obstacles for John to be a U.S. Senator. But it's whatever. If you like that ending, especially to forget the other movies existed, more power to you. I personally haven't seen past Terminator 2 Judgment Day, and I don't plan to. I sang this movie's praises in the beginning, but I don't think I sang its praises enough. So after all of that, I'd like to go back and highlight just what makes this movie so outstanding. I love Linda Hamilton's narration. Her voice is quiet and grave, which perfectly matches the tone of the beginning and the other moments in the movie where it's utilized. I can always appreciate a badass female protagonist, especially since she's among the earliest and the best in cinema. The music is, of course, iconic, and I love the themes. There's the value of human life, humanity, and the battle of AI versus human, which, of course, has recently become front and center, where AI is encroaching by more sinister and subtler means. Support your fellow artists, writers, voice actors, filmmakers, and more, guys. I can't stress enough how important it is to combat the recent plagiarism via AI generation. But I'm getting off topic here. I greatly enjoyed Arnold Schwarzenegger as the good guy in the film. For having to act like a machine, his progression toward acting more human really helps to establish that bond, not only between it and John, but also between it and the audience. He may be stiff and awkward at times, because he is still playing a robot, but there is something charming about that awkwardness, and it's also fantastic to see the badass things he does to protect the protagonist, especially since he minimizes his fatalities. Robert Patrick was incredible. I definitely preferred him as a villain to Arnold in the first Terminator. Robert Patrick nailed being cold and calculating, but measured. His utter remorselessness as he spears people in the head is chilling. I'll give credit to Edward Furlong. He nailed the punk-ass kid with a heart of gold. He might steal and damage property, but his aversion to physically hurting people is quite touching. I did enjoy the moments between him and the Terminator. And last but not least, James Cameron. The dude has an uncanny knack for action-adventure and writing badass female protagonists. As far as I'm concerned, the film is perfectly shot, perfectly paced, and the stunts are phenomenal. I can only imagine how difficult it is working for this guy, but I can appreciate that he is of the go big or go home school of thought. That is it for this podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, please like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Next episode, I keep with an unintentional robot theme by doing a story analysis of 2023 sci-fi thriller, The Creator, which is one you won't want to miss. Until next time, this is K.O. Lynn, signing out.